Welcome, everyone. It gives me tremendous pleasure to facilitate a conversation with David Olusoga and the UK television industry following his groundbreaking MacTaggart Lecture at the Edinburgh Television Festival. Hello, David.
Hi,
David and I will talk for the next half hour, and then I'll put questions to him from the audience. So everyone, please start sending your questions via the YouTube chat function or Twitter at Edinburgh TV Fest. If you're not sure how to do that, please run and ask the nearest 8-year-old child to you. We really are losing our young audiences. Anyway, but first let's remember how amazing David's lecture was. The Grierson Trust Chair, Lorraine Hegarty, described the lecture as a, quote, powerful statement and a reminder of the, quote, woeful underrepresentation of BME people in the TV industry. David Lammy MP took to Twitter and described it as a exemplary, masterly and sobering lecture, saying it will without doubt be a catalyst to once and for all shift the dial on diversity in the television industry. And BBC Two chief Patrick Holland, who was this year's Edinburgh Advisory Chair, described your MacTaggart, David, as one of the proudest things I've ever been involved with in my life. It gives me immense pride to be involved in this conversation. So my first question is, did you expect such a positive reaction? If everyone loved what you said, why do you think discrimination in the industry still exists?
Thank you, Marcus. I thought the reaction was really positive within the industry, and I think that says a lot about the moment. I think I was able and felt empowered to say what I said because of the spirit of the summer of 2020, because of the spirit of Black Lives Matter. And I think the speech was a reflection of that moment, that historic moment that we're still living through. And I think the reaction was a reflection of that historic moment. Outside the industry, I think the reaction was pretty disappointing, because I think there was a determination to use the points I'd made about diversity and the failings of the past as a political weapon in the ongoing debates about the media, and particularly about the BBC. My great frustration with the reaction outside the industry was that I was quite careful to talk about the TV industry, not just the BBC. Some of the incidents and moments and reflections that I described took place outside the BBC, not in the BBC, while working for other broadcasters and indies. And I think, like almost anything that we raise about the industry, it will and can be weaponized in a kind of great political debate about the historic role and function of the BBC. So that was frustrating. I think it was also frustrating that it also, to a smaller extent, got swept up into a kind of culture wars battle. But then this summer, I mean, everything could get caught up. I mean, the problems not having an audience was spun into a culture war story. So outside the industry, I think it was pretty frustrating. Inside the industry, I think it was a reflection of the fact that we're living through a remarkable moment. And I do think genuinely that many people in positions of power in the industry, I think Matt goes far to say most people, have been affected and have in some ways had an awakening to the scale of the challenge and the scale of previous failures.
Let me pick you up on just one point with regards to the BBC bashing that you said it was used. Is that a result of the fact of you actually hedging your bets? Because you didn't name a lot of the companies and productions you actually suffered some of the racism or abuse from. Was that because, should we be naming and shaming? Were you being too cautious in not actually saying it was this production, that production, it was the BBC, or it was Channel 4, it was ITV? Can you really blame other people for picking up on the BBC when you didn't actually name and shame the people?
I think if we had not had the announcements that we'd had, the initiatives launched, the discussions that had happened, if we were still in the state of stasis about diversity that we were in, I think, at the beginning of 2020, then I think it would have been much more tempting and much more appropriate to talk about individual companies and individual broadcasters. But I kind of think at that moment when we are trying to sort of reset, as it were, that I think that didn't feel appropriate to me. It didn't feel the right thing. I kind of think no matter what you say, there are people for whom anything negative about the media will be transposed almost subconsciously as something about the BBC. The BBC is just it's the biggest ship in the fleet. It's the one that you are going to target if you're sort of firing a kind of rhetorical torpedo at British television. Some of that is just because of the size of the BBC, and some of it is because of the BBC by its nature is a more political subject than other commercial broadcasters. So I'm not sure it would have made that much difference, and I don't think that would have been in the spirit of 2020, which is it was an appeal for the industry to realize and acknowledge the failures of the past and to make real the promises of 2020.
Okay, well, I definitely don't want to fall into the same trap and get too BBC obsessed. All right, so let's move on. There were so many interesting issues raised in the lecture, but there are a few I want to delve into a little deeper. The first is about Blackness only being valued as otherness. You talked about the authenticity of Blackness, and you're only authentic if you are almost as different as possible from your white colleagues, i.e. your drug dealer example in your lecture. That puts us in an insidious position as Black people, in that if we are authentically Black, then it makes it very hard for us to maneuver with regard in the industry, because we're seen as other, we're seen as different. So how do you reconcile trumpeting and celebrating our Blackness while not being othered?
I think one of the issues, as I see it, is what I call unexamined thinking, unexamined racial thinking. And I've encountered a number of people in the television industry who have never, in my experience, have never thought about how racial ideas shape how they view other people and how they view Black people, have never thought about how the tropes about race influence their thinking about the programs that we make. And I've heard this, and I've encountered it a number of times, where subconsciously people think that Blackness is a form of authenticity that's not intellectual, that is not cognitive, that is it is a sort of folksy knowledge. It is a sort of spiritual and a non-analytical form of intelligence. Now, if you think about, and this may well be me as an historian who thinks too much about the workings of race and the history of race. What race said was that Black people could be of the body, they could be physical. It said Black people could be of the soul, they could be spiritual. What it said they couldn't be, this is the racism developed in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. It said Black people lacked cognitive intelligence. And that idea that to be intellectual is anti-Black, is inauthentic, is not a real Black person, I think those ideas are deep within our society, and not just within television. But I kind of think if your job is to tell stories, and especially if your job is to tell other people's stories, that examining your own thinking is absolutely critical. And I have worked with people who have damaged the Black people around them in television because they've had a very clear idea about what Black stories are and what they aren't, what Black voices can and cannot say, how they can be framed and how they cannot be framed. And when that is challenged, they get very defensive. And it's extremely difficult to challenge people on this thinking, because it's about what people are comfortable with. People are comfortable with Black people in certain positions, telling certain stories, very often in performative positions, and not as in analytical positions. I've been, as I said in the edit, I've looked at rough cuts or the plans for programs in which Black people only talk about their experiences and all the expert voices are white. And I've seen these programs and all these program plans constructed by very well-meaning, good people, very talented people who just haven't examined it. And it's not that they're bad people. It's just, this stuff's deep. We live in a racialized society. We live in a misogynistic society as well. The idea that race and sexism does not impact our thinking in subconscious ways, I think, is naive. And in some ways, what the spirit of 2020, the big messages landed by Black Lives Matter, are these ideas of analyzing our thinking, of understanding that racism is structural.
Okay. One thing which upset me a little bit, with regards to the praise that you got, is that you've just tapped into a lot of things. Said that you are passionate that your lecture was heartfelt and it was personal, right? Lots of things about it being personal. And that made me feel slightly uneasy, and I couldn't really put my finger on it until just now. And that's with you saying about Black people are allowed to have experiences, whereas white people are allowed to be experts. I don't know if that's something that you picked up on with regards to people praising you for your personal, heartfelt, passionate lecture. Does that actually, despite it being praised, does that actually fall into a racial trope that you're talking about? Does it undermine your expertise?
I think I'm quite cautious about this. I mean, I made the speech very deliberately personal, and I do that because I'm a storyteller, I'm a program maker, and it is one of the devices that you use to tell programs. I've talked about personal experiences in programs that I've made, and I've done so very deliberately because I think that's the way that you reach people emotionally as well as intellectually. And I'd like to think as a program maker, the big thing I've learned in my time is that you need to drive emotion through stories in order to tell stories, and that is a deliberate device. I also made it personal because it seemed to me that it would have been profoundly dishonest to have talked about these phenomena and these failings within the industry in the abstract, as if it had never affected me. It would have been to sort of, I have a friend who had this experience. It would have been a lie. It also would have been a betrayal of the many Black people I know and have encountered who've had similar experiences, and often had similar experiences that have led them to leave the industry. The issue about passion, I think there is an issue there, and there is a problem. I'm quite happy for people to think my delivery of a program or a lecture is passionate, as long as they're also aware that that passion is being used deliberately and intentionally and in a controlled and measured manner for intellectual objectives, that it is purposeful. It's not uncontrolled. It's not because it's not that I have passion instead of cognitive and analytical, intelligence. It's not that I'm not being strategic. Whenever I am passionate, it is strategic. In the series I made, Black and British, I went back to the house that my family were driven out of when I was a 14-year-old boy. We were attacked by the National Front and forced to move house. And that was an extremely emotional and horrible thing for me to do. But it was a device that I decided that I wanted to do in consultation with the producer I was working with. And it was decided upon for strategic reasons, because I wanted to begin a program and put myself in the story of racism in the 20th century. So I'm quite happy to be described, and my performance be described as passionate, as long as people appreciate that the passion is strategic and it's not a reflection of the absence of cognitive intelligence. There's a thought exercise that lots of people who talk about race often do, and I think this shows the problem here. And again, I have to caveat, I could be overanalyzing because that's what I do. I'm an historian, but this is the thought exercise. It's 3 lists. Name 10 Black athletes, sportsmen, sportswomen, and all of us can do that very easily. Then name 10 Black performers, musicians, actors who are Black and British. Very easy. Then name 10 Black thinkers, theorists, writers. And that's much, much more difficult. And if you think about the way race works, the way race was constructed in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, it said Black people could be physical. That was okay. They were strong. They were supposedly immune to pain, as one of the theories of the slave owners. It said that Black people were musical and performative and childlike. Again, in the world of performance, Black people are accepted. What it said was Black people did not possess cognitive analytical intelligence. And I think the fact that that 3rd list is difficult to come to shows that these ideas still cast a shadow over our society and over the life chances and expectations of people of color. And that's really what I'm aware of when I think about passion versus strategy and analytical intelligence.
Okay, I want to pick up on just one bit at the end with regards to Black people being allowed to be performative. All right, so you described yourself, and this is the one slight criticism, because it was an amazing lecture, but just one slight criticism of the lecture. You described yourself as one of Black TV survivors. All right. Now, later on in the festival, Patrick Holland, who I quoted earlier, said the faces of his channel have radically changed over the past 5 years. And he pointed to the likes of you, Adeda Peaton, Nadia Hussain, and others. But he then went on to say that diverse talent behind the camera is still being ignored. It's an issue that we're all very aware of. The fact of the matter is that you didn't survive behind the camera, right? You had to go in front of the camera to sustain a career. And the two highest ranked Black people in the BBC, June Sarpong and Kamal Ahmed, both have careers in front of the camera. Do you think any Black people can survive in broadcasting, or not any? Do you think most Black people in their careers can survive exclusively behind the camera if they want to break that glass ceiling?
I think it's a very good point, that that idea of Black people as performative, that being a place that our society is comfortable seeing Black people, because that is what the structures of racism tolerated. I think that's another way in which you can see the structure of racism. And racism is structural because it was constructed, and it was constructed along these lines. And I do think you can see that. And one of my great struggles is that when I became a presenter, that did not mean I didn't want to be a producer. And I was surrounded by people who presumed that it should be, and who it felt like I was stripped of my ability to be a producer. I was expected to not be a producer. I was sometimes asked to write pieces to camera, to write scripts, as if I didn't understand about locations and about cameras and about costs and budgets. And of course, you can't not be a producer. You can't unlearn all of that. And it was infantilizing. It was patronizing. And I think that is a reflection of the idea that in this arena, this performative arena, especially when your performance is deemed to be emotional, that our society is more comfortable with Black people in those positions. I think the fact that we don't have figures like Shonda Rhimes, we don't have these powerful Black showrunners who are behind the scenes, that we don't have this long list of Black directors who've never set foot in front of screen. I mean, I think if we had 10 Steve McQueens, I'd say we don't have a problem, but we don't. You know, another example is Michaela. I think, you know, Michaela's talents exist on both sides of the camera. But I don't know whether there's any chance Michaela could have got anywhere near where she's got if she wasn't also a very talented actor. So there is a sort of a problem it's a bit like in football. How many of the Black managers were former players as opposed to white managers? Because having been a sportsman, having been in the world of physicality, that's a place that Black people are accepted. And from there, you can go on to do other things. But without that, it's much harder. So with the caveat that I think about this stuff deeply and read quite a lot and think about it probably too much, I do think you can see the reflections of the function, the structures of racism within the ways people's careers have played out or not played out in television. To me, becoming a presenter was just another way of telling history. I'm sort of monomaniacal. I just want to do history and art. That's all I've ever wanted to do. And so my strategy always was, if you only want to do one thing, you've got to be able to do it in lots of different ways. So I thought, I need to write articles. I need to write books. I need to be able to do radio programs. I need to be involved in all the ways history is delivered. So being a presenter to me was just another way of doing history. But I underestimated quite badly how it would be seen as a perfectly valid reason to end my producer career. And I'm very saddened that I've had to, I think, be quite aggressive in the way I've run my career to actually be allowed to be a producer. Because the thing I like most of all in television, the thing I think I'm best at in television is development. Development's the greatest intellectual challenge in our industry. It's fascinating, trying to devise new programs and new formats, trying to adapt what we know about the changing tastes of audiences and to find ways of telling stories that are relevant and fresh and new and exciting. That's the most interesting thing. I love presenting, but it's not the intellectual challenge that development is. And being constrained into a performative role was not something that I was willing to allow to happen. But I felt a huge pressure from people who presumed that's what I'd want and presumed that that was right and acceptable and the appropriate thing to do.
Okay. I love the way I've been really fortunate so far in that my questions just seem to flow effortlessly from your points. But I think it's because you make so many great points that I'm able to do that. So thank you, David. So my next thing is about that intellectual ask, which is your lecture effectively only had one policy ask: for Ofcom to step in and do a better job, or of regulating diversity, or a new body to be set up. I think that was the only one real concrete policy ask that I saw. Good, I'm glad I haven't, I've summed it up well. Have you spoken to Ofcom since? And what do you think? Do you think Ofcom is actually up to the task? Were you just being polite when you were saying they need to step up, or there be another body? Could you elaborate on that? Because as I said, that was the one policy ask. I'm really interested in how that has progressed since your lecture.
Well, Ofcom have been in touch, but I managed to get coronavirus just after giving the lecture. So I was in bed and haven't been able to begin those conversations with them. I think it was a purposeful and I think quite modest policy ask. It was to ask our industry regulator to do what it's done in other areas, other objectives of the industry. I mean, I'm talking to you from Bristol. I'm from the Northeast. I've had to spend so much of my career in London. I've lived in London. I've worked, traveled to London almost weekly for 20 years because of the dominance of London. And that is shifting now. And Bristol feels a really exciting place to be making television, despite the tragedy we're going through at the moment. And that change has been brought about by the industry, by pressure from government, and by pressure, the cooperation of Ofcom. And I think it is possible. That shows that when we have the will, when the regulator steps up, when government's involved, that we can make big structural changes. I think 20 years ago, the idea that you'd be able to move whole departments and huge amounts of production out of London would have been seen as fanciful and as idealistic. Well, it's happening. And I think we can do something similar with diversity, but I do think the regulator needs to step up.
Okay. Now, after giving the slight criticism at the very start, saying, should you have been naming and shaming, right? I'm now going to say that you did something which was far braver than I've ever done. I've written countless speeches with Lenny Henry, for example, and there's one word that we always avoid, right, whenever I've written a speech, and that's the R word, right? And you mentioned racism 8 times in your lecture. I did a little Control F. Do you think we need to talk less about diversity and start shifting the conversation to start talking more about racism? Were you very conscious? As I said, I'm petrified of the word. Literally, I'm scared to actually ever mention it. Should we be mentioning racism more?
It was a very purposeful decision to use that word. We live in a society where arguably it is seen as a bigger challenge and a bigger issue to accuse a white person of racism than it is for a black person to be a victim of racism. It is something that's been used against black people when they've been challenged on, whenever they've used that word, it's been turned against them. It's an extremely dangerous word to use. However, I think in the spirit of 2020, in the summer that we lived through, what we're talking about is the structural nature of racism. Now, structural racism is still racism. It can be subconscious, it can be unintended, it can be something which is imbibed from culture and rather than something sort of delivered with venom. But it's still racism. It's still racism to be comfortable with black people in some arenas and not others. Now, if we're going to talk about the structural nature of racism, if we're going to talk about being anti-racist, not passively unracist, but actively anti-racist, where we look at the structures, the cultures we've created and identify what has an effect, what is in effect racist, what damages in an indirect racist way the life chances and the opportunities of people of color, then I think we need to use the R word. It's very different to blithely using the word racism for slights, which, and microaggressions. I can see people are very cautious about that, and I think they're right to. But when we're talking about life chances and careers, I think racism is the right word.
Yeah. Well, and especially once again, more statistics have come out today from CDN, from Project Diamond, highlighting just the atrocious lack of people, non-white people at certain stages in their careers, and script writers and production executives. And so, yes.
Can I just say also on that, I mean, you know, that thing about imbibing the spirit of a moment, you know, I was really inspired by what Steve McQueen said in an interview in The Guardian, where he said that our failures were blatant racism. And, you know, I took the courage to say what I did from the young people who led those demonstrations, from people like Steve saying what he did. And I think, you know, in some ways that's this moment. The moment is about describing the world as we see it, describing our experiences. 2020 has been a year in which Black people in many situations have talked for the first time about their experiences of racism. And, you know, I'm invited to talk to lots of companies. I'm invited to work with lots of companies and talk about their diversity inclusion policies and their experiences and the journeys they're on. And what I hear this year is about remarkable, painful conversations between co-workers and friends. This year, people have heard and asked questions of their Black friends, people they've known for decades, about how racism has impacted upon their lives. It's been a year of incredible honesty. And for me to be reticent about my own experiences and about racism in 2020 would have, I think, have been to miss the opportunity that I'm grateful to have been given by the Edinburgh Television Festival to give this lecture. I think it would have been a kind of political decision that was more about strategies than about, you know, seizing opportunities. Okay,
so my last question, before we go to the questions which are coming in, there's some really good ones that I've seen. With regards to it being a moment for 2020, there's that constant question, is it a moment? Is it a movement? Now, I know you're a historian, and historians are, you know, traditionally very uncomfortable looking at the future. But looking to the future, what would be the mark of success with your speech, looking next year or 5 years on or 10 years on? What do you want to have achieved from your speech? And do you think your speech or your lecture will be successful? What do you think the industry will look like in 5 years' time, 10 years' time?
I think the lecture was a small part of a bigger moment. I think success would be if that was the last time diversity had to be mentioned from the MacTaggart podium. I think success would look like in 5 years' time, rather than there being yet another session entitled "When Will There Be a Black Controller?" like the one that you ran this year, and like the one that Pat Young was involved in 12 years ago. If the next session is that Black controller in a controller session, talking about their ambitions, talking about the project he or she has commissioned, that would be success. I think success is easily measured. It's about not repeating the failures of the past. It's about not having initiatives that at the end of them we say, that didn't change the dial, that didn't achieve things. It's about being proactive. Industry after industry is being proactive. They're going out to universities and they are changing their recruitment policies. They're going to schools and identifying people at young ages. I do a lot of talking with legal firms and financial firms. They are being ruthless in their determination to change the dial on diversity. I think we need to up our game. My experiences, my observation, I'm in a kind of fortunate position. I talk to lots and lots of organizations in different sectors, different institutions. I go into lots of companies back when we could physically go in to places and talk to a lot of people. And I see life in different sectors. And I have to say the creative arts are behind. People in financial services and legal services that are full of kind of hard-bitten, very ambitious people who aren't the sort of liberal lovies that we are in television, they're doing much better. They're being far, far more proactive than we're being. And it is the liberal arts, it's television, it's publishing, it's newspapers, it's curatorship, it's the heritage industry that is not achieving much. Because what I think happened is we presumed, because we were nice, lovely liberal people, that positive outcomes would just emerge. Well, that hasn't happened. We've given ourselves a free pass. And I think we need to be much, much harsher on ourselves. I think we need to look at other sectors and say, are we being as proactive about them? Are we going with this idea of being actively anti-racist, which means going out and finding people, not opening doors, not making it easier to have access, but finding the people who we've excluded and convincing them not just that the doors are open, but holding their hand to walk through them.
Okay, David, I could literally talk to you all day, not least picking up on your use of the word we, when sometimes we means Black people excluded and sometimes we means the industry. But I won't do that because we've got some brilliant questions that are coming in from the audience. One is from Michelle Matteson, who has just put in a question saying, David, why did you feel the need to set up your own company? And so I'm assuming that the thinking behind that is also, could you have done it working within a larger company? Could your career have survived working within one of the large indies or working for another company? So why did you set up your own company?
It seemed to be the only way I could remain being a producer while also presenting. I think our industry has a very big pigeonholing urge. It desires you to be one thing or another. And people who are hybrids or do more than one thing, I think we've just culturally, we struggle with that. And it seemed to me to be the only way that I'd be allowed to be in development meetings, pitching stuff, and in an edit room working as an exec, and the next day out on location being a presenter. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there was other ways of doing that, but that seemed to be the only route available to me. And also I had a business partner in Mike Smith that I really wanted to work with. So the combination of the pull factors of having somebody who I really wanted to be in business with and the push factors of not finding another niche in the industry where I could do all the things I wanted to do, those came together and formed Uplands, the company that we built.
Because a lot of people are now talking about the role of BAME-led indies or Black-led indies. And you didn't really, in your lecture, you were talking more about the racism and the careers of the individuals have faced and structurally. What do you think are the challenges that are facing BAME or Black-led indies? If you can talk from a personal perspective from running your own indie.
I mean, I'd rather speak from the experiences of people that I've spoken to. I think what they talk about is a legitimacy question, that they are deemed to be suitable for only certain sorts of programming, and that there is a strong feeling that Black-owned companies are seen as companies that can solve a problem of diversity and that they don't have any other function in the industry. And if you're a Black-owned indie and you want to devise a quiz show, or you wanted to make an antiques format, that would be seen as an odd approach, that you would be heavily questioned about not just are you appropriate, are you able to do that, but why would you want to? And I've heard that quite a lot, that there is a sort of a questioning of the legitimacy of Black-owned companies, and I think that's really problematic. But also, I look at the companies, some of the companies out there and the senior people running them with long careers, and I think they should be bigger companies. I think they should, some of the names out there, some of the careers that, decades of experience. We don't have any sort of big Black-owned indies in this country, unlike America. And I think that's a sign of how far we've got to go.
Okay. I'm very aware that we've got people outside of the television industry who are asking questions and are watching this conversation. So I just want to take another question about racism. David, could you share your thoughts on the intersections of English politeness and everyday racism/sexism?
I think that this is an issue that's being discussed quite a lot, whether politeness is stopping us having frank conversations about race. And I think there's some truth in that. I think there's lots of reasons why we aren't talking properly or haven't been talking properly about race. I think it's very, very difficult to discuss it. I think people, perhaps understandably, get very defensive when it's raised. I don't think the idea of structural racism has fully formed in people's mind, although it has been landed there, I think, quite powerfully in 2020. And there is a sense that, there's a very, very powerful and toxic phrase, which is playing the race card. And this is how Black people are gaslit. And people, it's very, very damaging when your life experience, when the everyday lived reality, when you are told that is not true and it's all in your imagination, and it damages people. People are incredibly, racism is, in my experience, the last thing the last factor that Black people want to conclude lay behind a decision or an experience. They will go around the houses to think it could have been something else rather than racism, because it's a horrible conclusion to reach. And Black people, it's not the first thing that Black people do. They're not eager to play the so-called race card. It's the last conclusion that you want to come to, obviously, because it's a horrible conclusion. But the problem is that it is incredibly difficult to confront race. And this insouciance, which is kind of part of the British character, that it is everybody's trying their best. It is not it's not a problem. They probably didn't mean it. You're being oversensitive. That just sort of plays in to the gaslighting. And I see people damaged by this. I've been damaged by this. I mean, talk about not wanting to use the word racism. I mean, I'm on the podium at the MacTaggart Lecture saying things I didn't confront people about at the time. I think that shows how difficult it is, that I felt enabled because of the actions of young people on demonstrations and other people raising their voice in 2020. I felt capable of doing it then and doing it from a podium of a lecture, but I didn't feel capable of doing it at the time, confronting people, confronting ideas, saying something. I just accepted it, and it damaged me, and I discussed that in the industry as well. So it's evidently very difficult, and this polite brushing away of racism really damages people. However, I would say that there is an argument that politeness about these discussions of race and gender is something that we need to get rid of and have franker conversations. I'm also very worried about the idea that we don't need civility in conversations, because I look at social media where there is no civility, and that's a swamp, and it's just as damaging. So I'm not that keen to brush politeness away, or civility as I prefer to call it. I do still think we need the rules of engagement that come with being civil and yet frank with one another. But the fact that I felt able to do it from a lecture podium but not able to do it in the flesh at the time, shows how incredibly difficult it is, and how these arguments are just brushed away, and how this device of gaslighting Black people about their lived experiences is something that is so damaging that people elect just to live with the racism rather than to have the damage done when their experiences are dismissed.
Okay, so we've been talking about racism, but as I said, often we talk about diversity, and we've got a few questions coming in, one from Angela Ferreira, but there've been other questions which have been sent in earlier about the word diversity. All right, and so Angela asks, should we stop using the word diversity? Is there a stronger word term? And Ali Castle sent in a question earlier, says, do you think it's helpful that all protected characteristics and other points of differences should be spoken about and dealt with together under the umbrella term diversity? All right, so how useful or how confusing is the word diversity?
I think it's probably no more confusing than any other phrase that we use, and this is a confusing debate. I'm personally not troubled by it. I think what's happened this year, which is really useful, is that the idea of anti-Black racism has burst out of the confines of the idea of BAME. And I think other forms of diversity, like socioeconomic diversity, can be talked about in their specificity without us trying to find a new word. I just don't think that word exists. I don't think there is a sort of neologism that we can fall upon that's going to replace diversity. I don't think it's fundamentally about the structure of language. I think it's about the willingness to have discussions. I mean, part of the lecture that I had to drop for time was about my experiences as somebody who's from a working class background, is brought up in the council estate. And the intersection between race and class, between gender and class, and all of these different protected characteristics, I think are critically important. And we're capable of using catch-all terms and talk about specifics at the same time. I don't think we need to abandon the idea of BAME, because I don't think it precludes us talking about anti-Black racism. And I think sometimes BAME is a useful terminology. So I guess I worry less about terminology and worry much more about whether we have the will to have these conversations.
Now, we've got a few questions that are coming in actually about addressing, I think, the mental health aspect that you talked about in the lecture. Quite personal, and I think I wouldn't mind the advice as well, which is, how are you looking after yourself? How can Black people in the industry self-care? How do you self-care?
Well, I mean, the thing that that's the most striking part of the MacTaggart experience for me was not the industry reaction or the reaction outside the industry. It was the number of people who were still in the industry or who'd left the industry, who wrote to me, who got in touch through social media and different platforms after the lecture and said that they'd had similar experiences. And that was, I mean, I talked about knowing people that had similar experiences, but I was shocked at the number of people who felt such affinity with me describing my experiences that they needed to get in touch and say something. And you have to presume those who decide that they want to get in touch represent a much bigger group who felt the affinity but didn't feel the urge to get in touch. And I believed, and I spoke to people before giving the lecture and talked about other people's experiences. And so I knew that my experiences were not unique, but it was depressingly reinforcing the reaction of people who got in touch and who described experiences that are just identical or in some cases far worse than my own. And there is a problem. People are damaged. There's people and there was a letter in the Guardian. Somebody decided not to write to me, but to actually, to express their experiences in print, because people have been damaged by the failures of the industry in this respect. And it's a really difficult thing to talk about. I didn't really want to talk about it. I've never talked about it in any program I've made or any article I've ever written. It's not something I ever really planned to discuss. And it's also something I hadn't told my family. So before the lecture, I had to phone my siblings and my mom and say, I've never told you this, but I'm going to talk about it in a public lecture because I think it's the right thing to do. And I think it would be dishonest not to. And it felt incredibly exposing. But as I said, to talk about this in the abstract and to not talk about my personal experiences felt dishonest, which would have been far worse than being exposed. I mean, there was quite a nasty outside the industry media reaction to that, as if it was special pleading, as if this was a form of Black victim culture, which is another toxic idea, a device that's used to silence Black people. I don't think I've got any strategies. I think the fact that I've used medication twice shows that I'm not the person best positioned to advise other people on how to look after their mental health. But I think when I give talks in universities or in companies and often invited in by people of color networks in those companies, I find myself saying at the end, look after yourself. I find myself saying, this is hard, this is difficult, this is painful. If you can't do it, you're not supposed to always be an activist, always be on the barricades fighting. If you need a break, you need a break. If it's too much, then it's too much. And I say that because no one ever said that to me. And I think I have a slight sort of, I think I'm always on a war footing. I think I'm always, my attitude is that we're always kind of fighting. I think that's probably quite a healthy attitude in television because it's always a struggle. Making programs is quite a combative experience. So I think I'm probably the last person to offer any advice in that area. I wish I could say that I'd found it cathartic talking about it. I didn't. I just found it exposing. But I think it was the correct thing to do in the context of trying to be honest about my experiences as a way of illuminating the industry's problems.
Connected to that, we had a question that was sent in before the lecture, which asked, how can you reconcile working with companies or individuals that have treated you in a racist manner in the past? Do you work with them again? Do you have to work with them again? And is it a draining aspect to constantly have to be educating people, even with this lecture, as to how to be anti-racist?
Well, I think there's two forms or two levels of racism. And in the latter, I'm not quite sure that racism is the right word. There's racial thinking, which I think is what we mean by structural racism. It affects our thinking. There's times when you think about a program and you don't think about gender diversity because your mind is somewhere else. And then you catch yourself and you think, this is not good enough. And I think people do the same thing when it comes to race. And I think all of us are sort of, we're all affected by the society that we live in. And we have these moments of catching ourselves and thinking, well, actually, how do we make sure that this program or this sequence or whatever is sensitively constructed and built, and that other viewpoints are available. And I think, I'm sure that I've worked with people who've said, I hadn't thought about this and I should have done. There's stories that I've been involved in where I've belatedly worked out that we should have thought about it in a different way. So those sort of experiences, I think, are the experiences of people trying to work through complicated ideas that are deeply ingrained within our society. And then there are people who I've experienced who just don't see it, who just don't get it, and I don't work with them again. And there's a few people who I just think they're blind to it, and that they are hostile when challenged. And I don't want to live with that. But I have to say, I mean, this is a lecture where I'm talking about our problems. I've met some of the nicest, most decent, most forward-thinking people in my life working in television. I dreamed of working in television and didn't know what the people in it would be like. And many of them are absolutely wonderful. And I think you only have to sort of look at some of the messages that were on social media after the lecture from people of all different backgrounds and ethnicities to show there's an awful lot of people who are desperate to confront our cultures and our problems and to make the industry better. So people who don't see it, well, they're not going to want to work with me. Never mind me want to work with them. And then there's the sort of clumsiness that we all have. And, we're clumsy with language. We're clumsy with presumptions and stereotypes. And that's because our society is littered with them. And if we can't forgive clumsiness, then I think that's not a constructive place to be.
Now, another question that was submitted before our conversation was from Ahmed, and that's in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. There's been a flurry of commissions on Black programming, etc. And she very fortunately says, my phone has been ringing off the hook. But what guarantee do you think there is that this will be sustained? How should we actually judge, these commitments? So, for example, have you built your new extension thinking you're going to get lots of new commissions for your indie, or do you think, let me just bank the commissions that I'm getting in 2020, and like COVID-19, it will probably pass?
I think it's a bit like the issue about when the first Black controller is just doing a session about being a controller and their Blackness is irrelevant. I think we'll know in a few years' time whether the commitments of 2020 were realized, and also if 2020 was the step change, the beginning of a new chapter in our industry's relationship to diversity and inclusion. This is where I think the regulator is important. This is where I think the fact that we've driven other changes through our industry successfully, and we need to apply the same level of rigor and assessment and monitoring to this issue. I think that's where this comes in. But I also think it's kind of up to the indie sector as well as the broadcasters. And I think, again, it's not just that the speech was seen to be focused on the BBC, it was seen to be focused on the broadcasters. The indies was where most people are employed. And it's how serious people who are running companies are. And I'm aware of the enormous challenges of running a company, particularly now, but we just haven't tried hard enough. We just haven't. It's evident we haven't tried hard enough. We've recruited in our own image. We've decided that the outreach that is needed is something that's beyond our industry and beyond companies. And that's led to where we are today, where the figures that you mentioned earlier are shameful. As Steve McQueen said, it's blatant racism. How can it be that in cities like London, where 41% of the population, 36% of the workforce are BAME, that we can have productions in which there's almost nobody who's not white? That should be intolerable, the same as it would be intolerable to have a production where there were no, if everyone was of one gender. That would be, we get that it was wrong because we've made progress, not as much as we need to, but we have made progress on on gender diversity. We need to do the same on both race and on socioeconomic diversity. We've done it in the past. We've made these big changes. We evidently, empirically can do it. But we have to find the will. I think it comes down to will. That's why I ended my lecture with that idea. Do we have the willpower? Are we willing to share power?
Yeah. Now, Pat Young has put in a kind of nice, contrary, as he always does, question, which is, David, you run an indie and know the volume of reporting you need to do to secure your final 5% payment. Should your reporting payment be increased and only paid when full diversity data is delivered?
Yes, I think it should be.
So you think that diversity reporting for all indies and productions, not just indies, but all productions, should be mandatory?
Yeah, because if we're serious about change, we need to be serious about monitoring what gets measured, what gets done, is to use the old business cliche. If we're not even serious about reporting it, if we're not even willing and open about what we've done on productions, then we cannot expect change. I think it's, why would you not want to? Why, even if your production was not what you would like it to have been in diversity, this is about providing the data, the lifeblood of any form of social change is the data. This is about being part of change. This is about playing your role. I think it should be mandatory, yes.
Okay, you're so beautifully brief and just yes was your first answer. I was the one who made you elaborate. So I'm going to ask you a few quick fire. We're getting to the end. So I'm going to ask you a few quick fire questions. All right, so mandatory reporting, yes. Ring fence money in the way that there's regional ring fence money or out of London ring fence money. Do we need that for diversity?
Well, it worked for the regional. It worked for regional production. So if it works, why not do it? We're trying to say, let's not make the mistakes of the past. We're saying that the structures of the past failed and we have a model that worked. Why would we not want to use something that we know works?
Okay, that's nice and quick. Next quick fire question. Systemic racism. Do the broadcasters suffer from systemic racism?
I think our entire society suffers from systemic racism because racism is constructed and it's deeply ingrained in our society, in our subconscious thinking. And I think that is the big lesson that we've been taught by young people in 2020. And in the minds of some people, when you say systemic racism, what they hear is that it is a sort of like extreme form of racism. What you're saying is the country's irredeemably racist. No, we're saying racism was built with huge effort. It was built by people who were trying to defend slavery and justify empire. It was built through popular culture. It was poured into the minds of our ancestors for generation after generation, decade after decade. It's there, it's imbibed, it's in our culture. It affects our thinking. It's just there. And the TV industry is part of a society that has a structural problem with racism, like it has a structural misogyny. This is just the reality of our societies. It doesn't mean our societies are irredeemable. It doesn't mean that all white people are terrible. It just means that these ideas that are incredibly powerful, race is one of the most powerful ideas ever generated. It took centuries to build and it's going to take decades to dismantle. And it's just there.
Okay. You are a historian, not a news journalist. So do you think you can be objective and support Black Lives Matter?
I think all historians would say they're objective as news journalists. I'm not quite sure what people mean by Black Lives Matter, because there are organizations that use that term. There's the group of women who invented that term. And then there's a global anti-racist movement that's used the slogans and the symbol and the phrase Black Lives Matter that is incredibly organic. It doesn't have a leadership. No one I know has a Black Lives Matter membership card. It's not the Communist Party. I think you can support anti-racism, and I support anti-racism. There's a lot in Black Lives Matter that I support. A lot of it, some of it is so specific to America, it's difficult for me to put a specific or a relevant viewpoint on it. But do I support being opposed to racism? Absolutely.
Okay, nice simple answer. Next one, would you support your child going into the television industry as it stands right now?
I'm not sure. I said it in the lecture that if I'd known how difficult it would be to be from my background and with my complexion in television, that I wouldn't have entered television, and I really mean that. I entered television out of naivety. I didn't know how lonely it would be. I'm not sure whether I would. I also am not sure, because when I joined television, you could aspire to having a staff job in television. You weren't as fragmented. I admire all young people of any background, but particularly those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and BME backgrounds entering the industry, because it's much harder now than it was when I entered, and it's incredibly tough for young people. And this is a generation who have life very difficult in all sorts of ways. Things are getting harder, not easier, as the generations go by.
Now, we're rapidly approaching the end, so I just want to possibly end on this question, depending on how long your answer is. With regards to allyship, we've had a question that came in before the conversation rather, which is, for those of us working to bring Black British history to light, and I think this question could be across television generally, how could you utilize white allyship most effectively in combating exhausting and time-consuming racist trolling on social media? But I think this question for me is broader, is how could we best utilize, as Black people working in the industry, white allyship?
Well, I think it has to be offered. And I think, in many cases, in my experience, it has been offered. And I think it's been the idea of allyship as one of the other ideas that's landed in the public consciousness, in the minds of many people, at least, in 2020. I think that idea that our society sees us all differently, and that gives us advantages and disadvantages. And where you have an advantage, you should use it to help those who have a disadvantage. I think that's just a fundamental idea that's just, I think, obviously true. And I think we do it all the time instinctively. I think, we would take a relative whose English wasn't good, and we would help them through an official procedure. That's a form of allyship. I think we would use our allyship when it comes to intergenerational abilities. Older people with experiences use their strength to help younger people. And people who are racialized in ways that disadvantage them need the allyship of people who are the privileged recipients of a racialized system. It's just another form of behaviors that we do instinctively.
Okay, so to address the specifics of that question with regards to the racist trolling, which I think everybody knows that you get on social media, as a good ally or as a good friend, should I be jumping on your Twitter account and supporting you against these racist trolls, or should I just be laughing to myself as you once again swat away ignorant racist troll? What's the best way I can support you?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure whether my strategy on Twitter is the right one. My view is that Black people are constantly told that racism isn't as bad as they think. And so I like to quote tweet horrific things that are said to me, because we all live in our bubbles. I mean, I don't think I understood just how misogynistic Twitter was until I became friends with Mary Beard and, was involved in threads in which Mary was attacked. And I think I was naive about what it is to be female on Twitter. And I think it's, personally, and I could be wrong, I think it's useful to show people what's out there. My strategy is, if you can make fun of people, or if you can refute what they're saying, which is usually very easy, because the one thing you never get in these accusations is any research, then if you can do it with a certain amount of humor and you can do it with facts, I think you can do it. What I hope I never do, and aim never to do, is to be angry, is to get involved in a shouting match with somebody who regards Black people as inferior. Because what is the point? There's no point trying to persuade people, win over someone who regards you as, a lower form of life. I think it's constructive. I think it's the right thing to do. It's the strategy I've started to do in the past sort of 18 months, but I could be wrong. I could be causing more damage than I think, and less sort of being less positive than I believe and hope that I am. So again, I'm don't think I've got any useful advice in this area. I'm doing what I do for the moment, and see if it works. But I mean, to be quite honest, I'm also doing it because it's so I mean, as I said, the one thing that is never in the racist trolling is any research. So people will criticize me for not mentioning things that I've written books about. People will, criticize me for hating white people when my partner's white, my mother's white. It's so easy to refute this nonsense. That part of it is just, it takes 2 seconds, and it makes me feel better than ignoring it. When I was a child in the schoolyard, I was constantly told, ignore racism, don't rise to the bait. You're only giving them what they want if you respond to it. And I found that a sort of belittling ask of a child. It was just accept it, just swallow it, just eat this stuff up. And I refused to do that when I was a child in the schoolyard, and I kind of refused to do it on social media. If somebody can show me and convince me that what I'm doing is unconstructive, then I would not do it.
Okay. Well, we definitely have not ignored racism today, although I do think we have risen above the sticks and stones that might sometimes be thrown at us. So
we'll have to check Twitter first before we conclude that. Let's check Twitter after this, and then we'll know.
Okay, I haven't checked my Twitter feed, for a whole hour without looking at Twitter. All right, time has caught up with us. On behalf of the entire British television industry, and I suspect even the international television industry, and dare I speak on behalf of the entire Black British community, thank you from the bottom of my heart for talking to us today. I personally believe with your help, we are turning a point, but whether that will become lasting change is yet to be seen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you to Stuart Clark, the creative director of the Edinburgh Television Festival, who produced the session, and to YouTube and Freeview, who are headline sponsors for the festival. All that is left to do now is to ask you, do you have a book to plug, possibly, David?
I do. I have a children's version, a young adults version of my book, Black in British, which is called Black in British, A Short Essential History, out now with Macmillan Children's Books. There we go.
Okay. And with that plug, thank you very much, David. And thank you very much for all the questions that came in. Bye-bye.